Nehmen Sie Platz, mein Kind. All right, hi. Very glad that you're all here. Nice to be amongst friends. Nice to have my spouse make it just on time. And we're here to hear a very special talk from a very special man, my friend Jay Bhattacharya. After much effort and great diligence, I now have to both spell and pronounce his name, which makes me also a medical expert. But I will spend more time talking about Jay than about me, because he is a lonely figure, and that's a distinction, not a curse, in the way in which we think about stuff today, having to do with vaccines, with government, with public health. And I now call Jay a lawyer by necessity. He had no intention whatsoever to think anything either good or bad about the First Amendment, because for many years he was a public health doctor who wrote papers of great importance and of no public stimulation whatsoever, which is the sign of an excellent scientist. So he was born in India in 1968, if I recall, comes to the United States, and then he is a pure Stanford-bred person. He has an undergraduate degree. Along the way, by mistake, he got himself a PhD in economics, and then he was also a doctor with a public health specialty. And what happened is, like so many other people who did this, medicine at the time when he first entered into the profession was a profession, as such, designed to advance truth within its own domain. The moment this changes can be identified with exact precision in the United States. Well, maybe not exact, but the date at which I put this thing was when we had the lockdown on March 10th, 2020. And at that particular point, pretty much everything changed. There was a speech by then and future President Donald Trump, who goes to the microphone and says, I heard about this drug, HCQ. I'm told that it works. And then a far wiser man named Anthony Fauci, if you recall, comes to the microphone and says, sir, there are no verified double-blind clinical trials which have verified what's going on. Ergo, you're wrong. Now, the problems are many. One is, what is the role in complicated situations of double-blind clinical trials? It's one form of evidence amongst many. But what it did is it set off a kind of a cascade in which fear took over. There was no available remedy according to the doctors, and so what we had to do was to run and hide and lock down in order to deal with the overall situation. And the situation doesn't get better, and there were some major calamities in New York State and Michigan and New Jersey, all blue states, Michigan. What they did is they decided that it was such a dangerous situation. They took people who were infected out of neutral zones and put them into old age homes, where they probably infected, if you take the 4 states in common, about 50 or 40,000 people, most of whom died given their situation. But expertise is owed its due. And so this continued pretty much throughout the situation. And then Jay and several others, Martin Kulldorff and Suneeta Gupta, started to speak out against this, did studies against this, started to point out the evidence that you really have to know something about the rate of transmission before you become confident of what the particular outcome is going to be. You really have to understand why it is that traditional responses to epidemiological problems are not good enough in these cases. There's a large amount of evidence saying you never do the kind of things that were done here. And then slowly this goes on, and by the September of 2020, we have the 3 of them sign the Great Barrington Declaration, which I think is a simple and powerful, but as he said, and I will say too, is one of the least original documents I've ever read in the history of mankind. But lack of originality in an age of error is not a problem. What you really want to do is to get this, of course, at which point he gets into the crosshairs of everybody else, including the powerful establishment. And there are conversations that took place between Martin Collins and our good friend Anthony Fauci saying, anybody who publishes this is not fit to hold public office, essentially, and we have to have a devastating refutation, whether or not it's true or false. Well, that was the problem. And from that time on, Jay has himself been involved in all sorts of issues, which, shall we say, do not play to his natural comparative advantage as a scientist, but do play to his natural advantage as a human being who understands the way in which human impulses work. And so he's become essentially the public voice of the resistance to the dominant positions inside the past administration on how this is to work. And what you have to understand is every action proposes a reaction, and the reaction to Jay has been extremely loud, extremely harsh, extremely, in my view, uninformed. And so what he did is something that most scientists do not do. He undertook the most dangerous occupation in the world. He became a plaintiff in a lawsuit dealing with these issues. The lawsuit was Murthy against the state of Missouri is the main one. The data that came out at the trial level was frightening. Case goes on appeal, it's slightly sanitized, gets to the Supreme Court, and they discover nobody in the world has any standing whatsoever to challenge any of the wrongdoings associated with that. Well, that's the rule in court. It's not the rule at the Hayek lecture. And so we are going to ask Jay to give that particular lecture, to talk about his First Amendment experiences, and to kind of cap it off. Just the other day, he was given the Zimmer Award, named after Robert Zimmer, a good friend and former president of the University of Chicago, who died too quickly. And essentially, what made Zimmer a famous man was a proposition which, again, is so banal, it should not require defense, is that you try to refute arguments instead of to suppress them. And, well, they try to do the latter, but this man is irrepressible and extremely well-informed. And so what he's now going to do is to take off where I left on, go far beyond it, and give a lecture about how it is a doctor works in outer space of First Amendment law. Jay, it's all up to you.
I'm absolutely thrilled to be able to give a lecture entitled the Hayek Lecture, because I read Hayek in grad school once upon a time, and then I reread Hayek for this lecture. So you'll forgive me if I indulge in some Hayek just because I can. But it turns out in rereading Hayek that had we listened to at least some of the ideas that Hayek had, we might have had a much better pandemic. So let me make that case, and I'll do it in the context of the story. So first of all, our pandemic management was an utter and complete and terrible failure. Right? This is not, I think anyone would disagree. There's one statistic that you can use. It's not a sufficient statistic, but it's a really important statistic, and that is all-cause excess deaths. All-cause excess deaths. How many extra deaths did we have relative to how many would you have expected had there not been a pandemic? You get that second number by looking at what happened before the pandemic, how many deaths there were before the pandemic in 2015 to 2019, and then you extend forward, you age adjust because the population is a little older, and then you just subtract how many deaths do we have versus how much you expected. And on the left over there, in the blue, is the United States. That's the excess deaths per capita, age adjusted, and it is about it's cumulative. So this is July 2024, and this is January 2020, and since then it's about 600 excess deaths per million population, or per 100,000 population, right? 700 people dead per 100,000. That is a large, large increase in excess deaths. It means that the life expectancy of the country has come down and stayed down. The green line down at the bottom, that's Norway. It's very early on seen as a tremendous success story in managing the pandemic, and they were a tremendous success story in managing the pandemic. Their excess deaths through April 2022, but basically zero. They had no excess deaths despite there being a pandemic. Remarkable, right? And the pink line up over here, that's Sweden. Y'all remember the stories from Sweden early in the pandemic? The killing fields of Sweden where everyone was dead. Turns out that's not true. Not everybody died. But they did have some excess deaths. Maybe in April 2022, they had maybe 50 per 100,000 population, whereas the United States, by then, by April 2022, was already up near 500 excess deaths per. Sometime in the middle of 2022, Sweden crossed Norway. And now Sweden has among the lowest excess deaths in the world. In fact, I think it's the lowest, with the possible exception of New Zealand. They're fighting with each other. It keeps crossing. Sweden was a tremendous success story. It protected human life without lockdowns, without the kind of policies that were adopted in state after state in the United States and in Europe. And if we are to understand what happened during the pandemic, we have to ask ourselves, why were they so successful? Like, if lockdowns were necessary to save human life, Sweden should have been the blue line, not the pink line. In the United States, you don't have quite a stark experiment, but because every state had some restrictions. But here you have in the blue line is again the United States, same U.S. line. The green line is California, and the pink line is Florida. I was an advisor to the governor of Florida during the pandemic. I advised him to keep schools open, to prioritize older people for the vaccines early, a whole host of things that turned out to be quite controversial, I guess. But Florida had lower all-cause excess deaths than California. And the question is why? How could it be that the places that locked down less hard, Sweden, no lockdown at all, had voluntary measures for with information. Why did they do so much better than the United States? Okay, I think Hayek has something to say about that. Let's see. All right, so this is I'm going to read this. I don't have this in front of me, so I'm just read. Can I read? No, I can stand aside. Yeah. So. There you go. All right. Yeah. So this is from a paper that Hayek wrote in April of 1982, or published in 1982, about the socialist calculation debate. And this is a really important debate because when the Soviet Union came into existence, the economic argument, taken quite seriously at the time, was that you did not need a market to decide how to allocate goods and services. The market sends price signals that convey relative scarcity, but also create vast inequalities. The question was, could you replace that with a bunch of economists and the newfangled computers that they had at the time, and make decisions about who got what, how much to produce of what, without actually running through a market? Because if you do that, then you could allocate them wherever you want, get rid of inequality, have the workers' paradise that you want, right? And an economist named Oskar Lange had written in 1936, Oskar Lange, this is Hayek's words, in 1936, Oskar Lange wrote an essay with the claim that socialist economies had sufficient information to efficiently plan economic production to meet the demands of the population, including demand curves and production functions, without the need of market prices. An absolutely remarkable claim, which Hayek absolutely detested. He said, no, there's no way, that's not true. Just to give you some examples of the kinds of economic models that people use to try to give flesh to the bones of Oskar Lange's claims. On the left are these computable general equilibrium models, where essentially, like, you have, the key thing is here is you've got consumer expenditures. That means you need to know people's demand functions. You need to know the utility curves and all this. You have like factor demand and factor costs, factor markets, labor capital. You need to know the production technologies. And the claim was that you could mimic a market just if you know those numbers. Just know, all the government has to do is know those numbers. And Hayek's claim was that you can't know those numbers, not in any detail. They change too rapidly over time. There's too much to know. The market allows a discovery of these facts as it develops, rather than something that can be engineered. It's more like a garden rather than a plumbing system. On the right is something called an agent-based model. It's just another version of this. Just think of it as, and you guys are too august a group to do this, but I have to confess, I play a game called SimCity. Anyone ever played SimCity? Oh, thank God, there's a few other people like me in the room. SimCity is just, it's a computer simulation of little agents, little people wandering around, creating an economy out of nothing. But you have to have parameters. Their behavior is tuned by parameters you don't get to see. In SimCity, they tune the parameters to create the most hilarious outcomes. Economists do it to create the most boring things, which is just basically a version of this computable general equilibrium model. It's just an agent-based simulation. It's like a SimCity of game. This is the exact framework used to manage the pandemic. The exact framework. In the pandemic, we have something called compartment models. SIR models or SEIR models, right? So in these compartment models, the question is, you're born susceptible. You're born in S. So in January 2020, the entire human population, well, that's not true because it leaked out of a lab in October 2019, but let's just say the entire human population is S. right? And some fraction of the population, some part of the population might make the transition by exposure to the virus, move into the E compartment. Now, many of the people that are in E will just go back to S. It's as if they got exposed but never got infected, or they got infected and got no symptoms. A few of them will become I, infected, and those people will. You see the back arrow will create conditions to make more people susceptible, move from susceptible to exposed. Some of the infected will die, and some of them will recover. If there's immunity, these people are essentially out of the model. They're no longer susceptible. There are versions of the model where they're recovered because the immunity loss will go back to being susceptible. This is just a first order differential equation model. It's just an engineering model. You just need to know the parameters of the movements, and you can almost every single pandemic. You remember seeing those things about a pandemic forecasting how many cases are going to happen? Their model's just like this. Or there are models, versions of this. This is an Asian-based model version of this. It's the same, actually, the same math, except this is the SimCity version of it. Here, you have little people wandering around, randomly moving, randomly interacting with each other. If an infected person comes within R of an uninfected person, infected person within R of an uninfected person, that person has a chance of being infected. So there's two interactions that meet that way, one way at the top, one down over here. This one results in a new infection, and that one results in not a new infection. But the math is actually the same. The math of these models, the Asian-based models, it's the same. It's the same math, and it's exactly this kind of engineering planning that went into the argument to lock down the country, to lock down the world. This is from Hayek's 1945. Okay. I guess I can read most of it. I don't know why the font changed. In 1945, Friedrich Hayek published The Use of Knowledge in Society, making the case that planners cannot possibly have such detailed information, that market economies are complex, emergent phenomena, and the market prices convey information about the relative scarcity of goods that guide behavior, right? And they can guide behavior in ways that the planners can't possibly know. That cannot possibly know, right? So can a computer model your interactions with other human beings to a complete degree? Because in order to plan around a pandemic, that's what it has to do. If you know that you're sick, would you go visit your grandma or an older friend, right? If you have that information, if you are a migrant worker and you're worried that if you're found to be sick, you're going to lose your capacity to work, will you report to an authority to get tested to see if you're sick, right? Will that be built into the model? When you know that the disease is spreading around, will you change your behavior? None of that is in the model. Will you hug your children when they get sick? That's not in the model, right? But all of those things are very, very important for disease transmission. So what's the consequence of this? This is from the Danish medical authorities in 2021. They did a report assessing how well these models actually did. The beautiful thing about these SimCity kind of models is you can run them twice. You can run them once with a lockdown and once without a lockdown and ask what happens. Almost always through the pandemic, the difference between what a model predicted would happen if there was a lockdown versus if there was not a lockdown was depicted as a measure of the efficacy of the lockdown, right? So for instance, this is from the Danish data. The green line is opening scenario. If Denmark opens up entirely, that's what is predicted will happen to the number of cases. The gray line is the lockdown scenario, and this blue line is the actual number of cases after Denmark actually opened. I mean, I don't know what to tell you. This kind of phenomenon happens over and over again. And it's not just, this is 2021. Let me show you from 2020. The very famous model, the Imperial College model out of Imperial College London, it informed policy all around the world. I actually got to go visit with President Trump in July 2020 in the Oval Office, which was it was an insane thing. But just imagine me sitting there in front of President Trump, and he looks at me and asks me if he had saved 2 million people by locking down the country in March. He said he asserted he'd saved 2 million people in March of 2020 by locking down the country. The source of that claim was a model just like this, that Imperial College model that shut the whole world down. Because the prediction was that within 2 months, if Trump did not lock down the country, 2 million people would be dead in the United States because of COVID. So, somebody took a version of that same model, the code was public, and applied it to the Swedish data. Now, Sweden famously didn't lock down. What they did was a very Hayekian approach to the pandemic. They told the public, here's who's the highest risk, older people. They recommended that if you had a job where you could stay at home and work, but didn't close any businesses, did not close any schools under the age of 16, for kids under the age of 16. They closed high schools for a short time and then apologized for it, closed universities for a short time, then apologized for it. And I think they restricted mass gatherings, right? No mass gathering over 100 or something. And that's it. That's the extent of their intervention. Someone applied the Imperial College model to Sweden, which didn't lock down. And so what you have here is the orange line is if there's literally no mitigation at all. No country did this. No country said no mitigation. The purple lines over there, the purple lines up near the top over there, is the projection of what would happen to the number of deaths in Sweden within 2 months of the March 2020 if they had the actual policy they followed. And the estimate was something like somewhere between almost 100,000 deaths in 2 months. And then again, this is just the SimCity model running. The gray line is what would happen if you mandate social distancing, right? Basically, treat humans as if they're all biohazards, put them in cages, and don't let them interact with each other, right? So the model has that gray line as the prediction. You would save 60,000 lives from the actual policy was the prediction. What actually happened, I'll just read to you. So how is the model's projection performing? Sweden's government stayed the course with its milder mitigation strategy. As of April 29, 2020, Sweden's death toll from COVID-19 stands at 2,462. Not 100,000, 2,462. It's the same exact thing as what happened in Denmark, except this happened very early in the pandemic. We knew very early these models were performing tremendously poorly. And yet they continued to guide policy for almost the whole pandemic. I'm sorry, Jack, it appears that my love for you was based on faulty epidemiological modeling. Yeah, don't structure your love life this way. It's not. It's just epidemiologists are very bad at this kind of advice, but also it turns out at epidemiological modeling as well. Okay, Hayek's Nobel lecture. Unlike the position that exists in the physical sciences and economics and other disciplines that deal with essentially complex phenomena, the aspects of the events to be accounted for about which we can get quantitative data are necessarily limited. They're necessarily limited. Human beings, the science of human beings, if economics can be called that, is an inexact science. The science of medicine is also inexact. Whenever human beings are involved, it's going to be complicated. And to think about human systems as if they're engineering systems and treat them that way is necessarily going to result in an error. This was Hayek's point, is what he called the error of scientism, right? To apply the models of physics, which are known with much more accuracy, to human systems, because human systems are much more complex. There's a distinction between a complicated system and a complex system. A complicated system is like a computer system. In principle, you can know all the ins and outs. You can really master every single thing. You know, it's like a lot of moving parts. A complex system is something where there's no way to know with any certainty because it's too complex, right? So a doctor, they call it the art of medicine because there's not a mechanical understanding of the human body. Right, it's a human, like you don't treat a number, you treat a patient. Is the way that medical students are taught. The same thing is true for societies during a pandemic. Scientism. The scientific attitude is decidedly unscientific in the true sense of the word. Some of the gravest errors of recent economic policy are a direct consequence of this scientific error. Here he's writing from his note. This is his Nobel lecture, where he's talking about the inflation of the 1970s. Caused by bad economic advice, right? With the computable GE models that had predicted that all you got to do is, manage the economy a certain way. Okay. Oh, this is kind of. Did anyone read any of these articles where they asked epidemiologists how they live their life? Remember those articles? I got asked once, and I was the one outlier. Like all the epidemiologists were among the most risk averse people I've ever met in my entire life from the evidence of these kinds of articles. Like it's 2022, and they're saying, this is from the Washington Post. What month was this? This was like 2023. Do they mask? Are they eating out? How COVID experts are living now? I wasn't in this article, but this article in 2023 had experts telling the whole world that they don't eat out. They avoid crowded situations, and they only go, even though they had COVID before, even though they had the vaccine, they still are avoiding the world. Experts telling you how to live your life. Should they be able to do that, right? So, where'd it go? Oh my gosh. Oh, there it is. I'm sorry. It appears my love for you was based on faulty economic modeling. Don't let experts tell you how your love life should go, or even whether you should hug your kids. That's a bad idea. Okay. Another idea that was pretty offensive, I think is the right word. Is your job essential? Okay, I have a yes. Who says their job is not essential? Is it not essential? Isn't philosophy like essential to life? I mean, am I not to think, is your job essential? How do you tell? Okay, let me put it another way. Do you want other people to tell you whether your job is essential? But that's what we did. We basically, I think every human being is essential. Okay, I know I'm a dreamer. I'm not the only one. But yeah, I think the height of hubris for a small class of people to tell us, each of us, whether we're essential or not. And it's also the height of hubris. We closed down churches, right? And it's unclear. This is Governor DeSantis in April of 2020 saying that churches will remain open because church is essential. This is my governor, same time period, essentially saying church is not essential. And in fact, with lawsuits to follow from the churches that thought that they were essential. Lawsuits that they eventually won a year later. Right? So is church essential? Is being able to attend a funeral of your parent, is that essential? Right? What is essential? Who gets to decide that? This is not an engineering problem. This is a question of human values, right? So you can see in Hayek the fundamental humanity of it. Like, we decide what's essential. I'm not going to go visit my mom when in the middle of a pandemic when I'm sick. That's not essential. But when she's lonely and has not seen another human being for a month, I'm going to go drive down to Southern California and see her, even though it's the middle of a pandemic. That's essential. Who gets to decide that? I get to decide that. You decide that for your own life, right? The idea that we can make this distinction, that an epidemiologist can make this distinction with the SimCity-like model, deciding what activities are essential or not, is something that we should never have allowed. Of course, it's only a prediction, but we can't guarantee anything, right? So I put this up as I have a PhD in economics, so I'm allowed to put this up. But it can applies to epidemiologists also. The predictions are just predictions. They're used to guide thinking about what the trade-offs are, not to engineer how we should live our lives. Okay, so Hayekian pandemic plans. Hayek did not, as best I can tell, write specifically about pandemics, but I found a man who is as close in spirit to Hayek in how he thinks about pandemic management as is ever going to live. This man, his name is Donald Henderson. And he's, I believe, the most important epidemiologist of the 20th century. He is responsible for the eradication of smallpox. Has anyone heard of Don Henderson? You all should go read his book about the eradication of smallpox. It's an absolutely brilliant book. Filled with wisdom. The key thing about the eradication of smallpox is you had a fantastic vaccine, but the whole parts of the world didn't take the vaccine. rather than trying to force everyone to the remaining parts of the world that didn't take the vaccine, what they did is most of the cases had been gone by the 1955 or 1960. Most of the small cases of smallpox had gone. Instead, what they did is whenever there was an outbreak, they would go to a town where the outbreak happened, isolate and quarantine the person who got it until he was better, and vaccinate the people around him. And people were willing to be vaccinated then because they didn't want to get smallpox because they saw their friend got smallpox, right? And they did that over and over again until 1979, the last natural case of smallpox that happened. And there hasn't been a natural case of smallpox since. There's a lab-generated case of smallpox that happened after 1979, but we're not going to talk about that. Okay, so Don Henderson eradicates smallpox. In 2006, he wrote a paper with the title Disease Mitigation Measures and the Control of Pandemic Influenza. What happened in 2006, there was a avian flu outbreak, same kind of flu, the H5N1 flu that's going around right now, infecting chickens all around the country. And it turns out, pigs and cows and stuff. And he wrote it with 3 other people who actually played a pretty important role during the pandemic. Don Henderson died before the pandemic started. I think died in 2017 or 2018. I can tell you right here, 2016. He dies in 2016. Let me just read to you from this paper. This is an exercise in asking what should happen if the avian flu really does make the leap into human populations. Because at the time, people thought the avian flu had a 20% death rate. And what if you have a flu that very easily spreads from human to human but kills 1 in 5 people? What do you do then? And so this is a thought exercise about how to manage a pandemic like that. Quarantine. As experience shows, there is no basis for recommending quarantine either groups or individuals. The problems in implementing such measures are formidable, and secondary effects of absenteeism and community disruption, as well as possible adverse consequences such as loss of public trust in government and stigmatization of quarantined people and groups, are likely to be considerable. How about how do you communicate with people, right? So I'm going to show you lots of evidence that the communication plan in the context of this pandemic, and I will tell you from personal experience, involved a systematic suppression of free speech rights of citizens. That was the communication plan, and then systematic propaganda. Here was Don Henderson's. Open and frequent communications with the public are essential. This involves regular press conferences, hotlines, and provision of information through civic leaders, churches, schools, and businesses, trusted people. An important message is to request that all who are ill remain isolated at home or in hospital, but to encourage others to continue to come to work so that essential services can be sustained. Let society go on. But if you're sick, stay home. An overriding principle, experience has shown that communities faced with epidemics or other adverse events respond best and with the least anxiety when the normal social functioning of the community is least disrupted. Strong political and public health leadership to provide reassurance and to ensure that needed medical care services provided are critical elements. If either is seen to be less than optimal and manageable, epidemic could move toward catastrophe. You know how the U.S. handled the Hong Kong flu in 1968? Was anyone around for that? I was in India and I had just been born, so I don't know from personal experience. But what I've read, they had this thing called Woodstock. That is how they managed. It was like this massive music festival that they held during a worldwide pandemic of the Hong Kong flu. You guys were not there for this? No, am I the only? Who actually went to Woodstock? No, I'm not going to ask that question. That's not a very polite thing to ask. Okay. Actually, this is a point of pride. Who went to Woodstock? Okay. Were you there? It was basically where I lived. I mean, that's fantastic. But this is. Were there any pandemic mitigation measures in place in Woodstock? There was not. See, so they were following Don Henderson's. A century of pandemic management was what Don Henderson just wrote, right? The most important epidemiologist of the 20th century. What we did in this pandemic was very, very different. In 2020, the WHO sent a delegation to China in February of 2020. In January of 2020, the Chinese government had locked down locked down Wuhan, locked down the broader province around Wuhan. Literally 20 million people, I think, no, 60 million people in the broader province were locked down in ways that were, and the United States would be considered a direct violation of human rights, right? They took large apartment buildings and barred the doors so you couldn't leave. You were not allowed out. You had, I mean, just by the way, similar things happen in Australia, so the West shouldn't be too proud of itself. Um, and so in February 2020, a man named Clifford Lane, this man right here, and then Maria Van Kerkhove, the chief epidemiologist at the WHO, and a whole bunch of other Westerners went to China to ask, did the lockdowns of January 2020 work? They came home and they wrote this report on the WHO China Joint Mission on Coronavirus Disease 2019. And this was their recommendations for uninfected countries. That's us. That was then at the time. We were us. We were still uninfected. Supposedly, prepare to immediately activate the highest levels of emergency response mechanisms to trigger the all of government, all of society approach that is essential for early containment of COVID-19 outbreak, to treat COVID as if it were a war. Not Woodstock, but war. He sent an email, Cliff Lane, to Maria Van Kerkhove on February 2020 about this report. He said, China has demonstrated this infection can be controlled, albeit at great cost. That is the bottom line of the report from my perspective. The global community needs to decide the way forward. That room needs more than this group. And when it got to more than this group, they decided they were going to lock the whole world down. The kind of thinking here is mechanical, right? And when the Imperial College model actually came out, it was literally mechanical. That was just a couple of weeks after this. The Imperial College model came out and said, if you lock down, you're going to save 2 million people in the United States within 2 months, or else 2 million people would die. The idea that there would be voluntary mitigation measures based on your local knowledge never occurred to these planners. Okay, so let me show you some of my work during the pandemic. So I was paying attention to a lot of the data that was coming out of China and about from the this was a huge error of mine. If I just stayed as a quiet professor, I would never have gotten into the trouble I was in. So my problem was like looking at the data. I should never have done that. I apologize. Let me just show you. So I published this article in March of 2020. I looked at the data and I thought, okay, there's a lot of COVID spreading around. And I thought there had to be much more than we saw. That's what happened in 2009 when the swine flu came around. In fact, what happened in 2009 when the swine flu came around was that originally people thought that swine flu was quite deadly. The WHO made public pronouncements saying that like 5% of people that get the swine flu would die from it in 2009. 5% case fatality rate. There were studies done to measure how many people had antibodies all around the world to the swine flu. Studies done. The way you measure antibodies is by blood. You take a little bit of blood, and then there's a standard test to check if you have a specific antibody that would only show up if you were exposed to the swine flu. And those studies found that there were somewhere between 100 and 1,000 people with antibodies walking around with evidence of having been exposed to the swine flu, immune to the swine flu because they were exposed, that the public health authorities didn't know about. And that basically diffused the 2009 epidemic, right? So I thought to myself, this disease looks like it spread very easily, spread by breath. There was that Chinese restaurant study where like one person on one side of the restaurant has COVID, there's a fan blowing, and then someone on the other side got it. Remember that study? That was really famous for a little while. And then the ship that was floating around where literally the Diamond Princess cruise, where literally everybody on board got COVID. 7 people died, all of them over the age of 80 or something. I wrote an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal in March of 2020. First time I ever written an op-ed in my life, and I wrote this hypothesis that what if it was like the H1N1 flu? What if there's hundreds of people that are walking around, or 50 people walking around with antibodies that we don't know about? The disease is spreading sub rosa. All we're seeing is the tip of the iceberg of the spread. All those like fancy maps with the red circles spreading, looking like the pandemic is spreading everywhere. That's nothing. It's already spread everywhere. That was the hypothesis. That led to a man from Major League Baseball who had ordered a whole bunch of test kits from China to measure antibodies to reach out to me and offer me the test kits that he was going to use for Major League Baseball, and said because he's like he wants to do science, and I ran a study measuring how many people had antibodies in Santa Clara County, California, in April of 2020, first week of April 2020. Then another similar study I ran in LA County the week after that. And what we found was that for every person that had been identified with having COVID, there were 50 people walking around with antibodies that nobody knew about. And 40% of them, 20 of those 50, could recall no symptoms whatsoever in the past 3 months. They were walking around spreading the disease without knowing it. And it turns out that estimate turned out to be true. 100 studies were done very similar to this in short order after this all around the world. There were three things to get from this study. First, the infection fatality rate from COVID was not 3.5% or 4%. That's what the World Health Organization was telling everybody, that the case fatality rate is 3 or 4%. The thing that was in people's minds was, if I get COVID, there's 3 out of 100 people getting COVID are going to die if they get COVID. That was actually a vast overestimate. In fact, the median infection fatality rate was 2 out of 1,000. They were off by an order of magnitude. 2 out of 1,000. It's more deadly than the normal flu, but much less deadly than what the World Health Organization was saying. Second thing, the disease is already very widespread. The lockdowns, which had been in place for 3 weeks, had failed to stop the disease from spreading. I'll give you evidence as to why that is, but that's a universal phenomenon. Wherever lockdowns were put in place, over time, the disease leaked anyways. A disease that's very, very difficult to stop. In fact, I don't think we have a technology to stop it. In fact, I know we don't have a technology to stop it. Certainly not then. And then the third thing, this is the kind of disease where it's either you suppress it at 0 the day it comes out of the lab, or it's going to 100. There's nothing in between. And the fact is that at 3% meant that the epidemic had a long way to go. The epidemic had a long way to go. So April of 2020, we knew all those three things. I published this study. 100 other studies then are done around the world all through 2020. Some places that have a higher infection fatality rate. New York, for instance, had a higher infection fatality rate, both because New York was an older population than Santa Clara, and also because the early treatment of cases in New York was just terrible, like a real misuse of ventilators, too aggressive use of ventilators. I think led to excess deaths, and also this policy of sending COVID-infected patients into nursing homes led to excess deaths in New York. In Africa, similar studies found almost 0 deaths, 0% deaths, because only 3% of the African population is over the age of 65. And so the most important fact, the Santa Clara study that we ran, we found 2 out of 1,000 death rate. The median infection fatality rate from COVID-19 was 2 to 3 out of 1,000. Right? We got the right results very early. This is the most important fact about COVID. While anyone can get infected, there's more than 1,000-fold difference in mortality between the old and the young. 0 to 19-year-olds, the survival rate is 99.997. If I just focus on babies, it's like 1 in a million of dying. Whereas for older people, if all 70 plus, it was like 5% risk of dying. For healthy older people, non-institutionalized, not in nursing homes, 3%, 2.5% chance of dying. Right, and you can see the gradient. There's a massive difference in risk. Young people face very little risk from the disease, but a lot of harm from the policies used to suppress the disease, especially the school closures. So let me talk about that. By the way, I published this. The death threat started almost immediately. It was just this, and my own university did a investigation because there were hit pieces in BuzzFeed falsely alleging conflicts of interest. They eventually concluded there were none. They knew that when they started the investigation, but they didn't announce that they concluded that there was no. I'm still a professor at Stanford. They didn't fire me. I just had to hire lawyers for the first time in my life, and it's just, you all are stressful to deal with when you're talking in the middle of something, right? So, it was quite a stressful time. Let me show you what else I was looking at then. In March 24, 2020, Narendra Modi, the Prime Minister of India, tremendously popular, uh, in face of these epidemiological models, he ordered 500 million migrant workers in the big cities of India to go back to their home villages, sometimes up to 1,000 kilometers away. And there, you can't move 500 million people in 2 or 3 days. You just can't move it. What happened is the trains were overwhelmed, the bus systems were overwhelmed. They don't have cars. There are people riding their bikes or walking, sometimes up to 1,000 kilometers. And you can see some of the pictures from this. They called it the Trail of Tears, like an academic writing about this called the Trail of Tears. 1,000 people died in that transit. And the migrant workers themselves, many of them, their entire life savings is wrapped up in the inventory they have. So when the cities locked down, they couldn't sell the coconuts or whatever they had on the street. That meant that they couldn't get the money to feed their families, which is what they did when they sold the coconuts, and they couldn't get the money to buy inventory for the next day. Their entire life savings disappeared that day. For 500 million migrant workers, and it was just heartbreaking. Literally 1,000 people died on the day that he ordered this. The UN in April of 2020 put an estimate out saying that COVID-19 will double, it's not COVID-19, it was actually the policies, will double the number of people facing food crises. The economic impact of COVID-19 will lead to 135 million additional people facing dire food insecurity. April of 2020. The economic dislocation, so what's happening here? This is another Hayekian idea, that the economies are deeply interconnected. When the West decided that it was going to lock down, our world, this 40 years of globalization, had lifted 1 billion people out of poverty. The way it did that is by the economies of the poor parts of the world reorganized themselves to fit better in with the West, with the trade systems of the West. And so when the West shut down, all the supply chain disruptions happened. The pointy end of that was somebody in Mumbai loses his job, can't feed his family, and then starves, or in Ghana, or in Sierra Leone, or somewhere. Right, some poor person goes under and then starves. So this is the projection: 130 million people as a consequence of the Western lockdowns. UNICEF put out 150 million additional children plunged into poverty due to COVID-19. It's always due to COVID-19, not the economic dislocations caused by lockdowns. The virus didn't do this. It was a policy decision to lock down. Right? Sweden chose not to. The World Bank, this is a projection from 2015 to 2018. This is the actual number of people who are at millions of poor. So 739 million of the world of the poorest of the poor, earning $2 a day or less of income. A huge improvement over time. If I go back, just 3 decades, this would be like in this, 4 billion people around the world are earning $2 or less of income, 3 billion, something like that. We lifted, billions of people out of poverty through improved economic structures. They projected that the lockdowns would raise, counterfactually relative, if there had been no lockdowns and no pandemic, about 100 million people additional would be poor as a consequence of the policies. We starved and impoverished millions, hundreds of millions, was the projection in, this is from May of 2020. So early on, we knew that there were going to be tremendous collateral damage to the poorest parts of the world as a consequence. And that's exactly what happened, right? So March of 2021 in the BBC, COVID-19 disruptions kill 228,000 children in South Asia, says a UN report. In Uganda, 15 million children were sent home from school in March of 2020, and for 2 years they had no school, not Zoom school, nothing. And 4.5 million of those kids never came back. So this story in NPR is when they finally opened up on January 10th, 2022. Uganda reopened schools after the longest closures in the world due to the coronavirus pandemic. For most students, it was their first time back in 2 years. 4.5 million of the kids, Uganda's planning authority said in August 2021, will not return to school. A generational impoverishment caused by the policy based on the projection models. there was a UN report, the UN Office on Drug and Crime in 2021. The effects of the pandemic on children have been far-reaching, with children trafficked for sexual exploitation, labor, forced marriage, forced begging, and forced criminality. What happened was a lot of these families, these parents, facing starvation, they had to make a very difficult choice: let their kids starve or sell their kids into sexual slavery or child labor. That's what the lockdowns did. Were the schools safe to reopen? The answer to that is yes. Right? So this says in Sweden, they never closed schools for kids under 16. Not one day. They had regular school the entire pandemic long. No masks, no social distancing. They don't have magical schoolrooms. They have like crowded schoolrooms actually. Nothing, no mitigation at all in the schools. And the question was, what happened to the teachers? There was a study that was done in June 2020 that was published as a preprint by a man named Jonas Ludvigsson that was ultimately published in the New England Journal of Medicine. And here's the result. From March through June 2020, a total of 15 children with COVID-19 were admitted to the ICU. No child with COVID died. And how about the teachers? Fewer than 10 preschool teachers and 20 school teachers in Sweden received intensive care for COVID-19 through June 2020. Remember, the spring they never closed the schools. As compared to other occupations, this corresponded to age and sex-adjusted relative risks of, and essentially, the school teachers were protected among the preschool teachers. School teachers that had lower risk of dying than other workers in the population. Low risk of dying, because being around kids was relatively protective. Weirdly, this is, by the way, replicated in Iceland, replicated basically everywhere they looked in 2020. Based on this evidence, Europe opened up its schools in 2020. In fall of 2020, almost all of Europe had schools open. This man, Jonas Ludvigsson, he faced this investigation by his university for lying about data, for a study that was ultimately published in the New England Journal of Medicine. Did lockdowns work? There are a massive meta-analysis of all the studies. You can imagine this is like full on, for economists, this is like, it's Christmas. Like you get to study did this effect of this policy work or not in suppressing human life? And there's all this econometric work about, because you can't do a randomized experimental lockdowns. You have to do difference in difference designs, and you got to do all this fancy econometrics. And so they did, there's 3 authors, Jonas Herby, Lars Jonig, and Steve Henke, who's an economist at Johns Hopkins University, doing a literature review and meta-analysis of the effect of COVID lockdowns on mortality. And here's the result. The results of our meta-analysis support the conclusion that lockdowns in the spring of 2020 had little to no effect on COVID-19 mortality. How is that? How can that be? Lockdowns should work, right? If you keep people away from each other, how can you fail to protect? There's 2 things that happened here. This is the first thing that I'm going to mention, they emphasize, and this is a very Hayekian theme. People in societies where the lockdowns didn't happen, it's not that they did nothing. It's that they did mitigation measures that made sense in their own life, right? So if the Swedish health authorities said this is a dangerous time, they went out less. They didn't have to lock down because they trusted the Swedish health authorities, right? So the voluntary response by individuals was a real important reason why the counterfactual of not locking down wouldn't have caused mass deaths, as we saw in Sweden. The second thing is that our societies are deeply unequal. And the capacity to lock down, economic capacity to lock down, is held in the hands of a very small fraction of the population. In the United States, maybe 20 or 30% of the population, I think, worked in jobs in 2020 that could, in principle, be replaced by work from home, 20 or 30%. For the rest of the population, lockdown means not working and potentially starving. And especially if you go around the world, maybe 5% of the world population has the capacity to lock down. For extended periods of time. The lockdown is necessarily, because of the how unequal our societies are, necessarily going to be leaky. Necessarily going to be leaky. I showed you Florida. I always try to brag about Florida because I told Governor DeSantis not to close the schools, so Florida did better than California. I showed you that already. The lockdowns are a luxury of the laptop class. And this really characterizes it, right? So here's a comic of this guy looking at this crowded building, a lot of brown folks, And he's sitting there saying, what part of social distancing do you people not understand? The lockdowns are incredibly classist intervention, right? It's a luxury of the laptop class. I call it trickle down epidemiology, right? I could have taken this from almost any city in the world. I took this from Toronto in Canada. This is March 2020 to October 2020. The gray line is the spread of the disease in the 30 lowest income neighborhoods, and the blue line is the 30 highest income neighborhoods. 30 highest income neighborhoods. And you can see this happened in every city, no matter where you look. High spread in poor neighborhoods, low spread in rich neighborhoods. If you look at Google mobility data, you see the same thing. Lots and lots of movement after a week or so in low income neighborhoods, almost no movement in high income neighborhoods. Right? The lockdowns only worked if you were rich enough to afford them, and only for a short time. In October 2020, I wrote this declaration with two of my colleagues, Martin Kulldorff and Sunetra Gupta. Martin is a professor at Harvard University, or was a professor at Harvard University. I'll tell that story in just a bit. And then Sunetra Gupta is a professor at Oxford. And when we wrote this declaration, we called for was protecting vulnerable older people better and opening schools. Those were the two main planks of the declaration. Opening schools, because already by October 2020, 40% of the deaths had happened in nursing homes. We knew that's where the most vulnerable were, and yet we didn't take real steps to protect them. It was immediately signed by 15,000 medical public health personnel, 50,000 doctors, and almost 1 million regular people. I'm curious how many people heard of it in 2020. Wow, you guys are amazing, actually. That's yeah, Richard signed it. Thank you, Richard. I appreciate it. I mean, the point is, I hate this. I hate the credentialism. I spent my entire life hating credentialism, but in this one instance, I thought, okay, I'm going to use this credentialism to my advantage. Stanford, Harvard, Oxford. The idea that the lockdowns that there was a consensus, a universal consensus in favor of them was a lie. I knew that because my friends from around the world with backgrounds in epidemiology were contacting me saying, this doesn't make any sense, Jay. Why are we doing this? And yet the public discourse made it seem as if the entirety of the scientific community agreed with the lockdowns. The data I showed you so far, the data are from the UN about the collateral harms. Nobody disagreed about that, right? The data I showed you so far about the inefficacy of the lockdowns, professors from Johns Hopkins or from Karolinska in Sweden, right? So what I've showed you is what scientific data around the world was showing, and yet the picture being painted was that we must lock down or else millions will die. The point where the president of the United States looks at me and tells me that's why he locked down, that he'll save 2 million lives, right? Which he still says that to this day. Okay, so the focused protection, better mitigation of high-risk populations. So deploy the masks and then when they eventually came, to protect older people. Young adults live normal lives. I think we robbed this generation. If you're younger than say 40, you should feel robbed. Certainly if you're younger than 20, you should feel robbed. You should be angry at people like me. And then let children go and play with their friends. Here's an example of what focused protection can do. Okay, so here this is a Swedish graph again. I love Sweden. There's a huge number of cases in January 2020, January 2020, and then there's a second wave in the spring of 2021. In March of 2021, the Swedish health authorities, they got a slow start to the vaccine. They had vaccinated, only 7% of the population was vaccinated, but almost 100% of the oldest were vaccinated. Almost 100%. They had you couldn't get a vaccine unless you met the age criteria. One guy in Public Health Sweden he was 40 years old, jumped out of line, got the vaccine out of line, and then he was immediately fired because he skipped the line. And so they were very serious about focused protection, of using the vaccine for focused protection. The graph underneath is the deaths. This is the deaths corresponding to this wave when there was no vaccinated individuals in Sweden. And this is what happened to deaths in the spring spike. I've lined it up. There were almost no deaths, or what happened was there was a decoupling of cases and deaths. That's what focus protection looks like. A decoupling of cases and deaths. We have no the vaccine doesn't stop you from getting and spreading COVID, but it did reduce in 2021 the likelihood of dying, especially if you'd never had COVID before. And so it's a perfect tool for focus protection. Use it to protect older people. For younger people, the absolute risk reduction from dying was already so tremendously low that the benefit of the vaccine is very low. And of course, there's some side effects. So you can use a vaccine like this for focus protection, but you can't use it to get rid of the disease. It's not like the measles vaccine, which is fairly complete. Okay, so I've given you my view of the science. I've hinted at sort of the pressure that will happen around this. We wrote the declaration October 4th, 2020. 4 days after we wrote the declaration, this happened. This man is Francis Collins. He's the head of the National Institute of Health at the time. And he wrote an email which was FOIA'd, and I learned about it a year after he wrote it. On October 8th, 2020, 4 days after the declaration, he wrote to Tony Fauci and Cliff Lane, a man you've already seen already he was on that WHO mission. Hi, Tony and Cliff. This is my webpage. I'm like, what does this guy do? Like, this is crazy. We literally put this on a webpage. The proposal from the 3 fringe epidemiologists, Stanford, Harvard, Oxford, who met with the secretary, we met with the secretary of HHS, seems to be getting a lot of attention. And even a co-signature from the Nobel Prize winner, Mike Levitt at Stanford. It's so fringe that Nobel Prize winners are signing it. Richard Epstein signed it. That's how fringe it is. Okay, there needs to be a quick and devastating published takedown of his premises. I don't see anything like that online yet. Is it underway yet? That led to hit pieces on me, accusing me wanting to let the virus rip. Here's one. This was co-written by Rochelle Walensky, who was about to become Biden's CDC director a few months later. Trump wants to try for herd immunity. Without a vaccine, it could kill millions. Try for herd immunity. That's a scientifically illiterate statement. Herd immunity it's just a biological fact of coming out of those compartment models, right? So if half the room has immunity, when there's random interactions between an infected individual and some people in the room, half the time there's no chance of a disease spread, right? That's herd immunity. If you can think about economically, an individual who is infected generates a negative externality for the people he interacts with, right? Because he might spread the disease to them. Herd immunity mitigates that negative externality by making it less likely that random interactions will result in disease spread. That's just a biological fact. For coronaviruses, for flu, and a whole host of other diseases, herd immunity is how these diseases, the epidemics come and go. They wax and wane because of herd immunity. It's just a biological fact, right? So if you run the first order differential equation models, you'll see herd immunity kick in eventually. The disease doesn't go to 100% of the population immediately. What happens is there's waves. That's what's predicted by those models. It's because of herd immunity. It's just a biological fact. There's not a strategy. To say this is akin to saying that I'm going to land an airplane using a gravity strategy. The question isn't, am I going to get to herd immunity? And the question isn't even, is herd immunity permanent? It's not permanent if if immunity wanes, right? It comes and goes. That's why you see waves. The question is, how do I land the airplane as safely as I can, given that gravity exists, right? So the Great Barrington Declaration mentions this biological fact as a background fact that will control ultimately how the epidemic is, and that's, you can see it already. The disease is here to stay forever. Societies go in and out of a sufficient fraction of the population being immune such that the disease no longer spreads, and then back out and in and out. That's just normal. That's how diseases spread. It's endemic. We have no capacity to eradicate it. In the history of mankind, we've intentionally eradicated 2 diseases. One of them I already told you about, smallpox, and the other one is rinderpest, which is a disease of cattle, where we had a fantastic vaccine and it took a century. So this was a biologically illiterate statement by the future head of the CDC. And then Tony Fauci responds with, Tony Fauci responds to Francis Collins, this is the White House, is too busy to worry about this. What you said was entirely correct. My quotes are accurate, but not appreciated by the White House. And he links this Washington Post piece, COVID herd immunity. In this piece, he accuses me of wanting to let the virus rip and kill people. That led to death threats against me. That led to vicious attacks. Eventually, it led to 100 of my colleagues signing a letter trying to get me fired from the university. It led to Scott Atlas, who's another person at my university. The faculty senate voted to censure him using religious language, calling essentially, they called him anathema. What he was doing was anathema. A gross violation of his academic freedom rights. And it was directly the policy of the U.S. federal government to do this, to destroy the careers of scientists that disagreed with Tony Fauci. And this isn't about the vaccine either. This is about the spread of. This is about the Great Barrington Declaration. Sartre didn't have it quite right. Hell is actually other epidemiologist. It turns out. Okay. The black. So I joined Twitter in 2021. How much time do you guys? Okay. I usually. Okay. I got 15 minutes. I should be able to do that. In 2021, I joined Twitter after a decade of telling my students, don't join Twitter. The way you make a difference in the world is you publish scientific papers. I need to go back and apologize to them because it turns out Twitter is how you make a difference in the world. I didn't know at the time. Let me just describe what happened, right? So I joined Twitter in 2021, August of 2021, because Martin had been censored for a tweet that he gave. Martin Kulldorff wrote a tweet saying that that it's irrational to require to recommend the vaccine to children. It's completely rational to recommend the vaccine to older people. That you should take account of the age stratified risk, and the risk benefit ratios are such that that. And now Martin had been working in vaccine safety for 3 decades. Right? He's one of the world's most important vaccine safety scientists and statisticians. The FDA uses Martin's statistical infrastructure for detecting side effects of vaccines in post-market surveillance, right? And so it's perfectly within his rights, right, to make that statement on Twitter. Twitter suspended him, and because of that suspension, Martin said, "Jay, you should go on Twitter. We need to get the word out for the Great Barrington Declaration." And so I do everything Martin tells me to do. So I went on Twitter and I signed up, and Twitter was interesting. Almost 100,000 people followed me immediately because I've been on Fox News, I guess, which led to more attacks on me in the university. But and it was really great. I mean, there's a real rush from you write something, 100,000 people see it, and there's all these likes coming on. You know about that? I mean, I was just like, this is fantastic. Why didn't I join Twitter earlier? The purpose of joining Twitter for me wasn't that, though. I joined Twitter because I wanted to get the word out to people who hadn't seen the Great Barrington Declaration, right? The purpose, I had a single purpose, right? It was essentially, it's no longer science for me, it's advocacy, right? I want the policy to change. I'm going online to say to the people, to convince people to disagree. So I was quite happy when I would get somebody that disagreed with me so I could reason with them. Reasoning is something hard to do on Twitter, it turns out, but that's another matter altogether. What never happened was that my tweets would be seen by vast numbers of people who didn't follow me. I had a lot of followers. By 2022, I had almost 250,000 followers on Twitter, and but never did I have a tweet that was seen by people really outside of my network. Never. In October 2022, Elon Musk bought Twitter, and in December 2022, he let some journalists in to go see the Twitter files, which is basically the internal databases of Twitter. And one of the journalists, a woman named Bari Weiss, who runs the Free Press, used to be a New York Times journalist, posted this. This is what she found. She found this picture of me in the Twitter databases. 240,000 followers. That's pretty good for an academic. Can I just brag for just a second? But literally nobody. And then here, this is the key thing I want you to look at. I can describe this. This was crazy. But I mean, just this one. Trends blacklist. Twitter had placed me on a blacklist with my not knowing it. This is not something that's available to the public. I didn't know about it. This was in the internal database of the Twitter files. The first time I saw it was when Bari Weiss tweeted about it, because Elon Musk had opened up the internal database of Twitter when he bought it. And I wasn't the only one. Elon Musk invited me to go visit him in Twitter headquarters. I got to see this with my own eyes, and then I asked whether Martin Kulldorff had been placed on a blacklist. It turned out he had. Martin Kulldorff, every time he tweeted about schools, should be open. With that Swedish study, that New England Journal study, if you do his Twitter feed from 2020, it's just that study over and over and over again. It's like, why aren't you guys listening to this? He got blacklisted every time he did that. And then it ultimately suspended because of his tweet saying not everybody should get the vaccine. Let's have older people get it. I tweeted this. This was my first tweet. This is the Great Barrington Declaration. That's it. In fact, that was I did all kinds of things about the pandemic, but the purpose was of my Twitter. This was literally the first tweet I did, and it's this tweet that led to the blacklist. There's something about what the Twitter hated about the Great Barrington Declaration. But why would a private company want to suppress a professor from Stanford tweeting about a policy proposal? Why would they want to do that? This is the day I joined Twitter. It turns out I was put on this blacklist. What does the blacklist mean? The effect is that although I don't know it, oh yeah, please. If you guys, this was supposed to be interactive, you guys. So just it literally is, if I tweet and you follow me, you have some positive probability of seeing my tweet. But you all, half of the room that don't follow me, you have zero chance. A trends blacklist. I'm preaching to the choir, and I don't even know it. That's what a trends blacklist does. It makes sure that the vast number of people who don't know anything about me have zero chance of seeing me, and I don't even know that. And I have 240,000 followers. I have no Twitter experience. I'm pretty happy. I'm getting 100 people to like my things, and the adrenaline, the dopamine is flowing. It's great. But the purpose was to see all the people that had never seen this argument before, and that can't happen on a trends blacklist. Right. Right. The answer to the question is they were told not to, but by who and why? And it turns out, and this is what Richard alluded to, it turns out that it was a specific policy of the American government to pressure social media companies to censor people and ideas that it didn't like, that contradicted the policies of the pandemic policies of the government. That was a specific and it was remember, society-wide, government-wide. It was government-wide, right? It was the CDC, the Surgeon General's office, the NIH. It was the FBI. It was the State Department. It was a government-wide policy to go, and I hate this word jawbone because it makes it sound like it's just something you just talk. It's not just talk. What it was a pressure on the social media companies to say, if you don't censor these people and these ideas, then we're going to go after you. We're going to use the regulatory bodies of the government to go after you. We'll embarrass you in front of Congress. We'll call you up in front of Congress and make you testify in ways that embarrass you. The president will go up and give a speech saying that Zuckerberg is killing people. We're going to destroy you if you don't listen to us and censor Jay and Martin and Sunetra. It started with Trump, but it wasn't the policy of that didn't, in the Trump administration. It was the CDC got requests from Twitter saying, well, what's true and what's false? We don't want to spread false things. And then so they would give them information. That was the beginning of it. But it intensified during the vaccine rollout under the Biden administration. That's nothing. Like my colleague at Hoover estimated what the consequence to children from the learning loss, and he estimated something on the order of $60 to $100 trillion over the lifetime of the children. Yeah. Rick Hanishek. I think it's the lockdowns. I think the U.S. panicked and Sweden didn't. When what Don Henderson said about the impact of panic on societies, we saw the wisdom of that played out in real life. When we panicked in 2020, people stayed at home and died of heart attacks because they were so scared to go to the hospital. They skipped their cancer treatments. They skipped cancer screening. They skipped diabetes management. They decided it was healthy to go stay home and like never exercise. We told people that if you get the vaccine, you can go get fries and burgers we bribed them with donuts. We systematically told people that you and I are biohazards and we should treat each other as such. And so we disconnected from all of our normal social structures that sustain us. And it's tremendously unhealthy to have that happen. Suicide rates went up. The drug overdose rates went up. Motor vehicle miles went down in 2020, but motor vehicle deaths went up in 2020. Okay, so I think that in 2024, I can give this talk. The only place that invited me to give a talk like this in 2021 was a Catholic seminary. I couldn't give this talk at Stanford in 2021. I think the public at large understands something went deeply wrong. The leaders who enforce this have not yet said that they did wrong. And in fact, they give themselves awards.
When you showed the graph, I was assuming that the excess deaths would be from COVID.
No, some of it was from COVID. It's a real open question. How much was from COVID? There were a lot of people that died of COVID in Sweden, but they had negative excess deaths for everything else. The U.S. had a lot of COVID deaths and a lot of deaths from everything else. But see, that's a choice, right? So public health systems, the CDC, you ever play that game, board game Pandemic? There's a board game called Pandemic. It's you should go buy it. It's fantastic. It's like fiction. The conceit is that the CDC is this hyper competent organization that can manage 4 simultaneous pandemics all around the world. Before the pandemic, the U.S. public health infrastructure was the envy of the world. It was the envy of the world, and now, I mean, it's nowhere. So it's not exactly true. Yes, we were politically divided, but there was almost universal trust in the public health infrastructure, especially for disease management, this kind of disease management. It'll play out just like with the last one. Yeah. No.
My recollection is that a very large number of hospitals said that people who had COVID when they died from COVID as opposed to the other diseases they had. Do we really know how high the COVID
We don't. It's going to be impossible. And the reason is that we paid hospitals, if you're in Medicare, $50,000 to have a COVID. And the reason we paid hospitals is because so many rural hospitals were empty and going bankrupt. So the COVID, that original COVID $1 trillion thing that we spent was to bail out rural hospitals going bankrupt. But we tied it to COVID diagnoses. And there's still actually a $10,000 funeral benefit. If you die with COVID on your death certificate, the federal government, FEMA, will give you $10,000 through 2025. But if you die of cancer, they'll give you zero. So there's huge incentives to diagnose COVID. And so those numbers are messed up. I don't think it's zero, though. I think COVID really is a deadly disease for the old. I don't know exactly how deadly. It's a structural problem. The key. So the key. Okay, let me just. I need to get the free speech part. So let me just. I'll finish this, but let me just, because this deserves an answer, and it's related to this part, the free speech part. I think the central thing that can fix all of this is free speech. The central thing that can fix this, because it's the suppression of free speech that led to the collapse in trust. It led to the it allowed a kind of groupthink in our federal agencies and our federal public agencies to persist long after it would have gone, had there been allowed to be speech from the outside to criticize it. So that's the short answer.
Those people who still defend lockdowns, how is
I've never heard of this country that you're talking about. What is this? Sweden?
I'll translate from Lithuanian to English. He wants to know how it was that the people who support lockdown explain the anomaly of Sweden.
I've never heard of this country. I don't know what this country you're talking of. There's Norway, there's Denmark. Is there other countries in Scandinavia? I did not know of this. They just ignore it. Or they say some things like, well, Sweden did well because they have a socialist healthcare system. But Norway has a socialist healthcare system, and they didn't do so well as Sweden did. So what's Florida and California, neither of them have a socialist healthcare system, and Florida did better than California. They're not. It's really hard to cope with. The Sweden denialism is like a rampant thing now in health policy. Okay, let me show you. Missouri versus Biden. This is something that Richard alluded to. This is a case. In August of 2022, the Missouri Attorney General's office contacted me and said that, we think that you're being censored by the federal government, and we're going to sue the Biden administration to find out. That lawsuit led to a treasure trove of documents. You can find them on the New Civil Liberties Alliance has a website with the full discovery. We got to depose Tony Fauci for 8 hours, in which he said, I don't recall, 179 times, to basic questions about does Sweden exist or something, whatever, things like that. But we also got to read the emails of a dozen federal agencies where they're pressuring social media companies. Now, my name doesn't show up in those emails, but what shows up is the themes that I was talking about, right? So they went to social media companies and said, you must take down the speech that has these ideas in it. Then the federal government gave grants to institutions like Stanford, including Stanford, University of Washington, to develop misinformation laboratories, observatories, where they laundered their censorship activities. The university teams would go to the social media companies and say, oh, well, we've run our research program and here's where the misinformation is. But they were being funded by the federal government, and the federal government closely interacting with the federal government agencies about what themes they wanted should be identifying for misinformation. And the social media companies changed their terms of services and implemented AI algorithms at scale to tag any post that crossed. It's really okay. This is a hilarious story. In 2021, April 2021, the Johnson & Johnson vaccine turned out to have a problem, a clotting disorder that it caused. And the CDC paused the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. Remember that? Right? It was big news. The Biden administration, starting from the day they joined office, they were doing this pressure. Facebook had put in place algorithms to tag any account that it deemed to be anti-vax. So when the White House shared the Johnson & Johnson pause, the Facebook algorithms tagged the White House account as an anti-vax account. Yeah. So I don't know what to tell you. This is this was the policy, and they got trapped in their own policy, right? The Supreme Court in July of 2024, this year, I got to go visit you all. Who's been to the Supreme Court before? I've never. You all are so lucky. It was very intimidating, actually. Like you walk in. I'd never been. I mean, I've never been a plaintiff on a case before. It's set up to look very powerful, right? You got the 9 people. In a 6-3 decision, we lost on standing. The lower court had found. Did I put that? I hope I put that thing in there. Oh, I didn't put it in there. The lower court had found. Oh, here it is. Yeah, this is the lower court decision in July 4th, 2023. Judge Terry Dowdy of Louisiana. This is from the end of his decision. The plaintiffs have presented substantial evidence in support of the claims they were victims of a far-reaching and widespread censorship campaign. This is a federal judge writing this. The plaintiffs are likely to succeed on the merits of establishing the government has used its power to silence the opposition. It's not possible to read the discovery without coming to that conclusion. Every federal judge has looked at, including the entire Supreme Court, agreed with that. What I just read. Opposition to COVID vaccines, opposition to masking, lockdowns, lab leak theory, opposition to validity of the 2020 election, a whole bunch of other stuff. But all of these COVID things were like a central focus of the suppression of free speech by the United States federal government. The evidence produced thus far depicts an almost dystopian scenario. The COVID-19 pandemic, a period perhaps best characterized by widespread data uncertainty, the U.S. government seems to have assumed a role similar to an Orwellian Ministry of Truth. This isn't a federal judge wrote this. I mean, I testified in Congress saying that what would happen was an Orwellian Ministry of Truth. And a couple of the Democratic Congress, one of them accused me of being a mouthpiece for the Chinese Communist Party for this crime of doing it. I don't know how he got to there, but whatever. That's another. Okay. The Supreme Court in June 2024 overturned the preliminary injunction issued by Judge Terry Dowdy in the case on the idea that I don't have standing. Me and my co-plaintiffs do not have standing. They put out a rule of standing that, as best I can understand, is much more stringent than they normally would do in First Amendment situations. What they argued was that first you had to have an email with my name on it from some federal agency, some federal bureaucrat, to a social media company saying censor J. It's not enough to say censor J's ideas, just censor J. Then you have to show ongoing harm, likelihood of ongoing harm. The government swore up and down that they'd stopped, right? That's what they told the court. A couple of days ago, RFK Jr., he was not on our case, he filed a parallel case of the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeal just using this standing ruling throughout his case. Because they said that they couldn't show, they had not shown ongoing harm, ongoing censorship. Well, how are we supposed to know that as a citizen, whether there's ongoing or current censorship, if we don't even have discovery rights, if we don't have standing to sue? I think this is too much. I know this is too much because every time I tell this to a lawyer, they say, Jay, you're crazy. But there's no First Amendment. There's no enforceable First Amendment left in this country if you can't sue over this kind of thing and win. Essentially, what the government can do, this is and the dissent in the case, the 6-3 dissent, the dissent in the case pointed this out. Essentially, this is a blueprint for how the government can censor at scale. Just never name a person, name a theme. You're not allowed to say vaccines don't stop transmission. Then go to the social media companies, pressure them, and no one will ever have standing to sue over that. And if somehow, by some miracle, it comes out, Elon buys Twitter or something, that you're doing it, just say, we've stopped doing it, we're never going to do it again. And now, no, there's no future harm. This effectively guts the American First Amendment. It's a tremendously damaging decision. Our case is still ongoing. We went back to the lower courts, but we're going to lose because they're going to correctly apply this standing, and we're going to lose on this. Right? There's no evidentiary base that you could produce that would demonstrate that there was a violation of the First Amendment.
And you try to expose any of the people who in fact organize the plan.
we deposed Flavitt, we deposed Flaherty. There's all those are online, and this is why the judge wrote Orwellian Ministry of Truth. I mean, they were blatant about it.
They asked the question, did you intend to go after Bhattacharya and Kulba?
I don't think they asked that specifically.
You brought the better set of depositions.
Okay, I mean, they might have just said no. This is easy enough to lie about that. There is a man named Alex Berenson, a former New York Times journalist. He's crazy. I also love him too. He's a very crazy guy. But Andy Slavitt publicly said that he was going to go after him. Andy Slavitt was Vice President Biden's advisor on COVID. And because of Andy Slavitt's intervention, Berenson was removed from Twitter, despite, he didn't try to make an insurrection or anything. He literally just said the COVID vaccines don't seem to be doing what they're supposed to do. Okay, the ideology of public health. I'm almost done, I promise. Here's what I think the ideology of public health that was revealed by the pandemic. And this is the most anti-Hayekian thing you can think of. Treat your neighbor as a biohazard. That's the first rule of pandemics, the first rule of public health. You and I are mere biohazards. Don't love your neighbor as yourself. Love your neighbor by staying away from them because they're biohazards. Perversion of the precautionary principle. If it's possible that the harm from the virus is large enough, ignore the lack of efficacy and known evidence of harms from the proposed interventions. Tremendously important rule, turns out, for managing pandemics. Doesn't matter if the lockdowns don't work or cause starvation at scale. What matters is COVID is really bad. And it is. For older people, it's absolutely very bad. Swiss cheese. Shoddy evidence of small benefits warrants mandating interventions at scale. So even though there's not a single randomized trial demonstrating that masking toddlers as young as 2 years old has any impact whatsoever on the spread of the disease, mandate that every 2-year-old in the country be masked. Censorship, pressure social media companies to suppress even true information that contradicts public health authorities. Fearmonger, exaggerate the risk to induce population compliance. Beggar thy neighbor epidemiology, suppress global trade and travel for health, and then trickle-down epidemiology, policies that benefit the laptop class, benefit everyone. These are not principles that public health should live by, and that's the reason why public trust in public health has collapsed. Right? These are the opposite of what public health should be. I'll just end with this quote from Hayek. From this Essays on Liberalism and the Economy. The central concept of liberalism is that under the enforcement of universal rules of justice, conduct, protecting the recognizable private domain of individuals, a spontaneous order of human activities of much greater complexity will form itself than could ever be produced by deliberate arrangement. Never be produced by deliberate arrangement. This principle is much better than those principles I just talked about for public health. The engineering principles lead to absolute absurdities. And it's not that this is magical, right? That people are going to do mistakes. Right? It's not as if people won't do crazy things during a pandemic if they have this spontaneous order produced by a pandemic. In Stockholm, early in the pandemic, the care workers abandoned old people and left them to die from dehydration. This happened, by the way, in Belgium. This happened in Montreal. That was part of the spontaneous order. The fear around the virus itself led to that inhumane thing. Right? So it's not that spontaneous order always produces the right outcome. It's just that it self-corrects much more quickly than this engineering order. I'm all done, you guys. Thank you so much.
First of all, I'm going to be a double shotgun guy.
Because I have to speak out of both sides of my mouth. But I do want to thank Jay, especially for coming here and talking to us. I hope you don't leave here happy about the state of affairs in the United States. I hope that when the next administration comes in, I will pray that a certain man standing on my right will be part of it in an effort to try to reverse the trends that have so powerfully happened under these circumstances. And there is, I think, the following proposition that he embraces. I'll put it in a slightly different form. He did not use the word decentralization, but that's what he meant. And essentially what happens is if you know what's exactly the right thing is, there is only one solution that you follow, and you follow it all the way. And redundancy becomes a distraction. But if you don't exactly know what's going on, then in effect it turns out that redundancy is the only way in which you can actually find out through trial and error goes on. The question then is, and he said it, and I'm going to say it a last time because he's so right about it, he says, when you judge alternative systems, the fundamental question you have to ask is not do they always get it right? Nobody does. The question you have to ask is how rapid is the rate of self-correction given the fact that errors always incur and are endemic to human nature? And the answer to that particular question is, if you have one great mind, you'll get it wrong. If you have 100 or 1,000 careful and competent minds, what will happen is you will converge more quickly to the particular solution. And what happens is the central proposition of American progressive institutions is centralization and expertise is the dominant way in which social organizations ought to be ordered. And the question is not whether you want expertise or not. It's the question of what structures will bring it out. And I think this is just a talk on one subject, and I'm going to say as my last observation, or my eighth to last observation, is what he is talking about here is not unique to the public health world. I spend a lot of time looking on all sorts of hopeless issues, from climate change to public nuisance law to the Securities and Exchange Commission and so forth. And what happens is the same patterns exist with respect to every one of these social institutions. If you have somebody who's a real controlling czar with respect to the thing, you have what happened at the southern border. Czarism is a very dangerous spirit, and a free society wants government to basically set the rules of the game and not to be somebody who essentially plays all the key roles. Jay has been a champion and a hero in that particular situation. We ought to give him another round of thanks before we get a bite to eat.